Imagine wanting to travel the world to find new places and things during a time when there was no internet, no research or 5-star reviews to see if it's really where you wanted to go. Also, no Google Earth to check out the area and make sure that your destination 5-star hotel is not a remote cabin in the middle of a pig farm, and the 5 stars are just reviews from their friends or their many fake accounts. So, way back in time before jet planes, trains, or cars, and you really just had no idea where you were going. There was no Siri or Alexa to tell you, get in the left-hand lane, now turn right. Just a compass and your initial travel being by boat, but not an awesome all expenses paid luxury cruise or yacht, just a big boat with a bunch of other guys because women weren't allowed to do things. So obviously in this scenario, you're a guy too, no matter what. This boat maybe had one restroom for everyone, and restroom is code for a bucket over in the corner, and you would be in this situation for days and days on end until finally, when you're just on the brink of going completely mad, you've just finished up a conversation with a dead relative, and then you look up. You're not sure if your eyes are deceiving you or not, but everyone else that has survived this far sees it too, and now you feel it was all worth it. You have made a discovery, a new unexplored territory. You quickly give yourself a high five in excitement, and as you approach, you are flooded with a million thoughts. What possibly dangerous animals are there on this new land? What food, what water sources are available? Then your boat hits shore. You drop anchor, and though slightly scared, you're so happy to be back on land, you rush off and fall to your knees, kissing the sands, ready to explore this new land. After a while, things are going so well that you decide to make this your new permanent home, and you send for your families to come join you. Then one boat after another starts to arrive. You soon name the lands, build permanent shelters, and everyone who has come seems very happy with this new home. But after some time, you start to feel like you've explored a lot of the immediate surrounding area, and the others have too. But instead of being content with your discovery, you feel you need to explore further. So you grab some travel companions, a covered wagon, your trusty compass that's pointing west, you crack the whip, and you're off again to discover more new things. On your travels one evening, you stop for food and to rest. You're building a fire, you eat some roasted squirrel, and then lay your head on a log for some shut-eye. After you close your eyes, you hear rustling in the bushes. You quickly open them, you pop up. It sounds big, so you grab your musket. You run over to investigate. When you get to the brush, there's obviously a large animal moving around. It seems to come into sight, and it's a bear. Huge teeth and dark fur, but there's something off about this bear. It's standing on 2 feet. Wait, it has literal feet, like yours, and skin on its legs, not fur. The hands are not the hands of a bear either. They're not claws, they're hands, like yours. The skin of the animal is dark. You draw your musket. You point it between the eyes of the animal, anticipating an attack, and it throws its head back, exposing a second set of eyes and a face very similar to your own. The mouth of the creature opens and sounds come out. It's not a growl like an animal, but you do not understand it. Definitely seems as though it's trying to communicate with you, but no matter what, the sounds coming out mean nothing to you. And after minutes of it making noises that you can't understand, the dark creature wearing a bear's head and fur takes a step back, raises its right hand, and says, "How, white man?" Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Unable to communicate with words, you decide to put the musket down and raise your hands to show even without words you mean no harm, and the dark-skinned creature that you believe to be a man of sorts cannot understand you either, and even with your good faith gesture of lowering your weapon, it flees quickly off into the night. You pick up your musket and head back to your camp and quickly tell your travel companions about the encounter you just had. One of them mentions in their previous travels to a place called India, the people had dark skin and spoke an unfamiliar language that sounded like noise too. So the man he encountered must be an Indian. All of the explorers slept through the night, and when they woke, They would continue their travels until they came on another beach much like the one they arrived on. They made longer-term shelters so they could stay for an extended period of time and explore this land as they had done previously. One day, while out fetching water, an explorer put his bucket into the watering hole, and it was cold outside, but he's been working really hard, so he puts the bucket to his lips, and the cold water quickly fills his mouth. Suddenly, a hard object hits his tooth. Figuring it's just a pebble, the explorer reaches up and grabs the pebble from the bucket. He looks at the pebble, and instead of just tossing it aside, he feels a rush of excitement. His heart is pounding fast. He's overwhelmed with joy. He quickly starts looking through the water, finding pebble after pebble, and soon he forgets about even getting water for himself and his friends. His bucket's full of pebbles that give him complete, utter happiness, and he begins to run back to the others. And upon seeing the bucket full of pebbles, instead of being upset that there was no water, they too were overwhelmed with joy and started grabbing every bucket, bowl, and spare boot they could find, and made their way back down to go collect as many of these joyous pebbles as their items could hold. When they realized it would take many trips to collect all the pebbles, they decided they would just stay in this area until they could. But to make sure that all the pebbles that had brought them this overwhelming sense of joy and happiness couldn't be collected by anyone else, they had to stake claim on the land. So, according to the explorers, they were the first people there. So all they had to do was say it was theirs, create a boundary to let others know, and then that's pretty much it. It was their property from then on out. Soon the word had traveled far and wide of the explorers' discovery of these joyous pebbles, and people were coming from all over to collect some of the pebbles for themselves. So as they arrived, the newcomers would also find an area of land that had many joyous pebbles to claim as their own, and eventually these people became known as settlers, and there was so many arriving and claiming land that they kind of started taking it over. When the first settlers started arriving, it was just the original explorers and a few other groups of settlers, and they only took up a few chunks of land. But when more and more and more came, they started spilling into the lands that were occupied by the dark-skinned people like the explorers had encountered on their trip over. These people that the explorers had decided were Indians due to their dark skin and not speaking a language the settlers could understand, had actually lived all over the quote-unquote newly discovered territories for a long period of time. They were well established, living in villages that contained hundreds of peoples and families. For the arriving settlers that were kind of late to the party, this was an issue, because the Indians had the remaining prime lands and the settlers wanted it. Now the settlers had muskets, and the Indians they encountered did not seem to have any notable weapons compared to the settlers, and the settlers also had large numbers of people now who had the same goals, so they could take what they wanted by force, and they did. The amount of settlers that had joined the original group of explorers had grown so large that within a few short years, the territory they settled in would become the state of California in the United States. And the pebbles that had brought the original explorers so much joy and happiness and heartwarming feelings were actually chunks of gold. The original explorers had just set out to find new lands, and they ended up making one of the most well-known discoveries in history, kicking off what we now know today as the gold rush. So this is what caused the flood of settlers coming from far and wide to strike it rich. And after a while, there was such an abundant amount of settlers that there was no more available land left to claim, and the only thing keeping the later arriving settlers from fortune and riches were the Indians, who didn't even know what gold was or care. The currency used by the natives of Northern California at the time was seashells, so they could really give two flips about the pretty rocks that the settlers were going crazy over. When California became a state, Peter H. Burnett was appointed as the first governor of California. He began his reign in 1851, and with this, every Indian was now considered an enemy of the state, and he declared open season on their entire race. Governor Burnett called for the extermination of the natives, saying there will be a war waged against the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. and this was a threat that he would mostly make good on. But he didn't do this alone. He enlisted the help of the settlers. Now, the indigenous were already taking up prime gold rush land, pissing off the settlers because they, quote, needed the land to become wealthy and live the life of riches that they had come there for. So they needed very little encouragement to carry out the extinction that the governor was calling for. And even though the settlers had their own reasons for wanting the natives gone, the governor offered rewards such as payment for scalps of the Indians and more if they stole the horses of the natives that they had killed. The governor also funded militias and gave them weapons for the sole purpose of exterminating the natives. In the first 2 years of the gold rush, 100,000 natives had been murdered, and this was before the declaration of the governor that his intent was to make the native people extinct. And the natives they couldn't round up and kill, mostly women and children or whoever didn't fight back successfully or could flee successfully, were forced into concentration camps. Concentration camps, if you've never heard of them or of the Holocaust and you've never seen the well-documented footage of the carnage that would follow a stay in a concentration camp, they are not a camp like what you think of today when we hear the word camp. Not a summer camp or camping trip. In this case, camp is another word for prison, and these prisoners are not treated like the ones we know of today. So the prisons today, where inmates get 3 meals, outside time, access to medical treatments, and the opportunity to further their education if they choose to do so, no. These camps are prisons full of slaves. The people in these camps were completely dehumanized with zero regulations. They were worked and starved to death, but not just within the few days it took for them to pass on with no food or water. They would give them just enough to keep them hanging on for weeks and months until they were so malnourished and overworked that their bodies just shut down and they would die where they fell. Lack of nutrition and being extremely overworked were not the only things that led to their demise. Much of the time they would just be rounded up and killed by a firing squad or beaten to death. The women were raped and made into sex slaves. The children were taken and sold as slaves, where they would gather firewood, food, water, cook, clean, take care of the settlers' children. And the women would also be sold into slavery for the same purposes and would be raped by their owners, sometimes becoming impregnated by them, and they would have a baby that was born into slavery. Much of the time, the settlers would take the baby from the mother and sell it to be raised as a slave in another family, and they were the perfect slaves because they were ones who never knew any other life. Another reward the natives received for not dying was being stripped of their culture. This included their language, they were not allowed to gather, and being bilingual wasn't cool like it is today. So the settlers needed their slaves to understand them and communicate with them, and they required that they learn to speak English and going forward speak English only. Now, it's human nature. It's actually hardwired into us as people to survive. But with as horrible as the massacres of the native people were, being shot and killed, even if it took a while to die, seems like it would be far less painful than what the survivors endured to stay alive. Even though the government initially wanted the natives exterminated, they did learn the benefits of keeping them as slaves, and they even eventually had laws written stating that the value of a native child was worth up to $250. Today, that's an equivalent of $10,000, and with this, many of the indigenous children were sold into slavery. This would only be the fate of those who were left over from the massacres, of course. They didn't have any qualms about murdering women and children in these massacres either, so whoever was left over, if they had a chance to hide, and whoever was not successful at fleeing, they would be sold into slavery. This would only be the fate of those who were left over from the massacres that took place and slaughtered hundreds of natives at a time. One massacre was of the Tolowa people at Lake Earl. Lake Earl is in Northern California, about 3 miles north of Crescentcity, California, and about 15 miles south of the Oregon border on the coastal side. And back in 1853, Lake Earl was known to the native people of the area as the Archulet village. The indigenous tribe that inhabits these lands are the Tolowa, and a war was waged against them in their homeland simply for existing. The settlers back in 1853 would arm themselves, but not just to go out and kill natives. No, there was a good reason. A native man from this very village had stolen a horse from them, and for this he would be punished. The settlers, with muskets in hand, made their way to the village during the night. They found cover in the bushes around the village, and they made their intent known. They announced that they would not shoot until the Indians left their dwellings in the morning. This meant the settlers would not shoot anyone unless they refused to leave, and those who chose to stay, going against the generosity of the settlers, would be shot come morning. I mean, what other option did the settlers have? The natives were obviously thieves, and the settlers were trying not to have to kill them, but also had to protect their own people. So they gave this ultimatum. This would give the natives plenty of time to uproot their lives when they had nowhere else to go, but that wasn't the concern of the settlers, and if the natives were going to refuse the generous offer to relocate, then the settlers would have no choice but to make good on their threat of shooting those who remained. This was a great way to make the settlers victims and make it seem logical to do what they did. But knowing they had a governor arming and funding settlers for the purpose of exterminating the native people and offering rewards for the scalps of the indigenous and the horses of their dead, it seems a bit more likely that the horse that was stolen likely belonged to the natives in the first place. The settlers also likely got into position at nightfall when they would have the cover of the darkness, then waited until morning when they would have the light to see, paired with the advantage of already being hidden and in position. The natives likely never heard an offer to vacate from the settlers and were just ambushed. The light hit the ground in the morning, and the settlers readied their weapons, and at first signs of movement, they fired into the village, killing men, women, and children as fast as they could reload. Now, it is the 1800s, and they were using muskets likely with gunpowder, not automatic weapons. So the reload time would be about 1 to 2 minutes, and a very skilled individual could get off as many as 4 rounds per minute. Just in comparison, today the weapons used get off about 3 rounds in less than a second. So there would have been small bouts of time in between reloads, but just enough for the natives to get a short distance and attempt to take cover in and around the lake. But this didn't save them, and soon after the settlers started to fire, they had slaughtered the entire village, and the very lake the natives had attempted to take cover in had turned red from their blood. After the settlers believed the Tolowa were all or mostly dead, they took their muskets and fanned out, ready to hunt down every last native that had escaped, and after they were finally all either dead or captured, the settlers had no one standing in their way and claimed the lands as their own. Where the Archulet village had once stood, where hundreds of natives had lived in peace with their families, was turned into a huge trading post and shipping center that was built on the blood and bones of the native people. The Archulet massacre yielded a body count of 150 men, women, and children, and though this massacre of the Tolowa people seems like a massive body count, and it is, it's not the largest body count by far. There was massacre after massacre, and the body counts much of the time were in the hundreds. The settlers seemed to want to make good on the wishes of the governor and end the entire race of indigenous people. In 1851, the Wintu massacre left 300 dead after settlers burned down their tribal council meeting near Old Shasta in California. In 1852, Sheriff William H. Dixon and a group of 70 settlers slaughtered more than 150 Wintu natives in Hayfork, California, known as the Bridge Gulch Massacre. Another in 1852, the Wright Massacre of the Modoc occurred when Ben Wright and a group of settlers slaughtered 41 Modoc natives during a peace meeting. In 1853, the Archulet Massacre was not the only or the largest massacre of the Tolowa natives. The settlers also shot and burned down another coastal village, leaving 70 dead, and the slaughter of 450 Tolowa during one of their ceremonies where the settlers burned their rancheria to the ground. There's story after story of massacres wiping out hundreds and eventually thousands until very few indigenous were left in existence. The governor of California gave orders to exterminate the natives, and they did, or at least they tried really hard. And the slaughter occurred for the oldest reason in the book: greed, and for something the natives didn't even care about. This is tragically still the reason that the majority of crimes, including murder, are committed today. So in about 200 years, we really haven't evolved at all in that respect. This was just the start of the oddly high body count in Delnorte County. It goes back to the dawn of what we know as the American civilization. The extermination of the indigenous is where it all started, and even today there's an average of 2 murders per year in Delnorte County, and that's not including the unsolved, uninvestigated cases or the cases that they don't even count as murders, even though they should be. Some think the unusually large body count for such a small population is because the land is cursed with the blood of the natives that have painted the lands. It's also believed to be haunted with the spirits of those who have met untimely deaths throughout time. There are stories of ghost sightings and hauntings all over Delnorte County. So, is the land haunted with the spirits of those taken too soon? Is it cursed due to the slaughter of the indigenous all those years ago? There's definitely something going on there, and the people who have lived there, like myself, all describe it as cursed. It seems as though the town always sucks people back in. If you ever leave, at some point you always go back for more than just a visit, like I just did. And it always seems like there's this depressing cloud of darkness over the area. It's one of those places that never grows, it never gets better. If a business fails, which most of them do at some point, it's a constant stream of new endeavors in the same building. They just keep rotating through, but nothing new is ever built, and it's very rare if it is. Other than some pretty scenery, the area really has nothing going on for it, and nothing good has ever come out of that place. So that's going to do it for today. We're at the part where you know what to do. Subscribe, like, love, leave comments, turn on your notifications so you never miss an installment. I really hope you enjoyed hearing the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. Have a great weekend.